This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Hinderer Project X. And this, in addition to being Hinderer's newest knife, is really the peak of Hinderer's design. I'm going to go through this knife review in 3 parts, going through specifications, then talk about the knife tip to tail, then going through a sort of more systematic 10-point reviewing score to give you an understanding of what I think about this knife. But I am going to cut to the punchline right away. I'm going to say this, to me, is the best knife design that Hinderer has ever made. It is really the peak of their design. It takes everything that I love about Hinderer, that a lot of people love about Hinderer, and addresses a ton of the problems that Hinderers have historically had. It's a really good knife. I think in the end, this is actually going to be the single highest rated knife that I have reviewed yet on this channel. So let's get into why. Again, this is Clark the Knife, trying to give you the most helpful knife reviews on the internet, or at least on YouTube. Let's start with some specifications. The Hinderer Project X here. Like most Hinderers, this is a beefy boy, but not really any beefier than it needs to be. This is made in the USA at Hinderer's Ranch. I believe, I'm like 99% sure that 100% of this knife is made in the USA, including the screws and all that sort of stuff. This is not cheap, as most Hinderers are not cheap. This is a $500 knife in a configuration very similar to this. With Hinderers, aftermarket scales, put a titanium scale on here, stuff like that. They can easily start to creep into the $700-800 range. Hinderers are not cheap, but frankly, $500 for a fully made in the USA knife at this level of fit, finish, and quality is not difficult to justify in 2024. This blade here is 3.66 inches. This here is in the clip point. I believe the clip point, this particular shape here, is the only configuration that the Project X has been offered in so far. It's similar in design to sort of the spear point that you see on typical XM18s. Blade thickness is 165 thousandths. That is the same blade thickness that you get on your typical XM18s, your typical Eclipses, things like that. Scale thickness is also the same. The seal on this particular one is S45VN, but you can also find them in Magna Cut quite regularly. Most of the recent ones have been in S45VN. Most of the earlier ones were in Magna Cut. I think those are the only steels I've seen, though I'm sure that they either have made or will make them in 20CV at some point. 8.66 inches overall for this knife, 6.2 ounces, so it is not light. You're getting a lot, but it is not light. And the pivot, of course, is as typical for Hinderer, is the tri-way system, meaning this will come to you running on bearings, but can be configured to run on bearings or phosphor bronze washers or on Teflon washers, the way that Rick himself supposedly prefers them. Though I think most of the ones he's been carrying to knife shows recently, he has had running on the bearings. Let's go through some size comparisons, and I'm going to pull in some bigger knives I typically don't do. The most important size comparison here, and I'm going to have a whole video comparing these two knives, but it's a point of reference for a lot of people that play in this size range. This is very similar in size, very similar in overall feel, very similar in function to your Demco AD20. This is an AD20S that's on the table right now, but obviously this profile is the exact same as the full thickness AD20. You can see the handle design has a lot of similar cues between these two knives. The blade lengths are almost identical. The handle lengths are almost identical. Let's compare it to some other Hinderers. Here is an XM18. This is a skinny, but again, you can't tell from this profile whether it's skinny or not. You can see the blade length is a little bit longer than your XM18. The handle length is a little bit longer than your XM18. It's typical Hinderer line, things like that. It's still very much a Hinderer, but just a little bit of a bigger knife overall than the XM18. The biggest difference is, you see when you sort of fold them up, You can see because of this thick back end and the taller blade, it is much bigger in sort of overall pocket profile than your XM18. Let's pop that back out here. Let's compare it to another Hinderer, your Eclipse. Eclipse obviously similar in size to the XM18. You can see the similarities in blade shape here between the clip point, and this is a slicer grind, but similar to the spear point that Hinderer tends to do. It would just have a saber grind here, but it's a Hinderer. A little bit longer, a little bit bigger than the Eclipse in terms of thickness. Exact same blade stock thickness as your typical, Hinderer standard stock. Pretty much the exact same, I think literally the exact same handle thickness. Yeah, you can see there. I mean, if there's any difference in handle thickness, it's minuscule. It's probably non-existent. If it is there, it's quite tiny. Some non-Hinderers here. There's your Chris Reeve Sebenza. About the same length as your Sebenza, but a significantly larger, thicker, and heavier knife overall. Let's compare to your Spyderco PM2. Again, just a little bit longer in both the blade and the handle than the PM2, but just a significantly bigger knife in general. And then let's just to get a couple other typical comparisons. Here's your Delica. Obviously, it dwarfs the Delica. Here's your Bug Out. Obviously, it dwarfs the Bug Out. And I'll just throw a TRM Atom here because it's on the table. And you can see, even though it's technically similar in length, maybe a little bit longer than your Atom, it's a much, much larger knife. So, the Project X here, which is still, I think at this point, Hinderer's newest knife design. I mean, I guess technically the XM18 Auto came out after this, but it's also Hinderer's first brand new, totally new folding knife design, I think since the half track and full track came out. If you've been a Hinderer fan for a while, you might remember the full track specifically. The full track came out, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 years ago by this point. I know right when I was getting into knives, it was sort of one of the hot knives out there. The full track was a huge knife, huge handle, huge blade, very, very cool, very interesting in a lot of ways, but didn't sell quite as well as some of Hinderer's other stuff. And more importantly, they sort of mentioned that it was quite expensive and quite difficult to produce in the way they put it together. It also, honestly, the ergonomics were a little ungainly. It just felt a little awkward in the hand. And so the full track got discontinued, which is why old full tracks get ridiculous prices on the secondary market right now. They used to sell for below retail. Now you'll see people trying to sell full tracks for $800, $900. That is not an $800, $900 knife. But anyway, they discontinued the full track for a while. And the Project X is, I don't know if they explicitly acknowledge it, but in every clear sense, it is the successor to the Hinderer full track. The half track is still around, but this has the same sort of design as that full track in a package that is both more interesting, it is better, and I think it is probably better for and easier for Hinderer to produce at the kind of scales they would want to, or scale meaning the kind of numbers that they would want to. It also differs from your XM18 school in some pretty significant ways. The first is your blade here. So again, I'll pull out your XM18 for comparison, and I'll just keep it here because we'll be referencing it pretty regularly. In fact, let me use the XM18. That's more familiar to most people. This is a slicer grind, obviously. So this is 165 thousandths, which is still pretty thick stock. Standard for Hinderer, but thick by knife industry standards. But this is a very tall blade for Hinderer. And this has a ton of space to drop. If you look at that plunge, you see how thick that plunge gets back here. If you look down the ricasso, this actually gets quite thin down here because of how far it has to drop. This takes Hinderer's thick blade stock and gives it so much space to drop. They were smart, they kept a little bit of a saber grind here, so you do keep that full thickness pretty far out. But this drops so far and so aggressively that this is a Hinderer that comes down to a thin and slicey cutting edge. This is the first Hinderer I have ever had that I have not felt the need to reprofile the edge. So this is my Skinny XM18 review coming up on this one. I love this knife. This is one of my favorite knives. This is one of those knives where if you told me I had to narrow down my collection to only a couple, the Skinny XM18 would be one of them. For everything negative I said about the full-size XM18, most of it doesn't apply to the Skinny. But this has 140 thousandths blade stock, which is thinner than this guy. But because it has less space to drop, if you look at how much less tall this flat grind is functionally compared to your Project X, where I put the blades on top of each other, you can see just how much more space that blade has to drop. This Skinny was significantly less slicey out of the box than this Project X was. Now, they've probably gotten better at their factory edges than they used to be. I haven't measured the factory edge, but this feels like a skinnier, sort of narrower factory edge than Hinderer typically does. But still, this Skinny XM18 slices, even with my 17-degree edge on here, less well. It slices more poorly than the Project X does with a factory edge. This is legitimately one of the slicier knives that I own, and it is definitely one of the slicier knives that I own at this size range. It is slicier than your large Sebenza. It is significantly slicier than your PM2, which has a full flat grind and thinner stock. It is just as slicey, and if anything, might have a slight edge on a lot of my Demcos, and those are AD20Ss, which have thinner stock and Demco grinds, which are some of the best grinds in the industry, at least at a production scale. This knife grind, I'm harboring it because I've got a bunch of Hinderer reviews coming up in addition to the one that I've done so far. The biggest issue I've historically had with Hinderers, they're fantastic, phenomenally made knives, wonderful ergonomics, the best fit and finish that you'll see at a production scale other than Chris Reeve. I mean, Chris Reeve and Hinderer are very much 1 and 2 right now at large scale production. I put Koenig and Grimsmo and things like that in another category just because they operate at such smaller volumes. But anyway, there's so much to love about Hinderers, at least that I love about Hinderers. The price is the price. That's what you pay for that level of quality. But the big knock on them, legitimately, has always been that the damn things don't cut. This blade cuts. And this grind, this big, tall, flat grind, is the reason for it. They also chose to debut it with a really functional blade shape. This, you've got a high clip point here. It's not quite at the back of the scale. It's kind of similar in a way to what I said about the Swish buoy, which in that it's got a clip point here, and then you've got a belly up here, and then a big old flat. The difference is, my criticism with the Swish buoy blade shape was that blade shape didn't quite make much sense on a mid-sized knife. It felt like a knife that was, some of the design elements felt like they were designed to be a bigger, tougher knife, and that just made it kind of not, because it still wasn't a big knife, it didn't feel that great at bigger chores, and it also didn't have, the kind of either lower point or the kind of more control, like, with a blade shape like this with a slightly lower drop point and that more belly all the way, this is really good for smaller tasks, for more delicate tasks, and when you need to use that whole blade in a smaller knife, it makes sense. The fact is, on a big blade like this kind of clip point design works really, really well. You've got a high tip, which is very easy to get into any cuts, whether you're piercing a bag, whether you're cutting into some drywall, trying to get around some twine, trying to get, it's not so high that you can't get it down on a table if you need to. You can even cut down with the belly if you need to here. The high tip is nice and versatile. The belly and the overall just very long cutting edge is great for stuff like cardboard, for stuff like cutting through a bunch of brush and twigs and digging into dirt and all sorts of stuff. I've used this for everything that you would use a knife of this size for. And this is a big knife. This is a big knife for big knife stuff. And this blade shape stays in cuts easily. It slices and glides through things very easily. It's a pretty traditional clip point shape functionally. Hinderer puts these cool swedges and things like that on here. They cut their flats a little differently that sometimes hide how typical their blade shapes are, how standard some of their blade shapes are. It makes them look cooler, more interesting. It's one of Hinderer's sort of signature little touches. But this is just, it's a very well-designed clip point blade that drops a ton from thick stock. This ends up being a really nice, versatile blade shape for the sort of things that you would want to use a 6-ounce, 3.5-inch blade for. And at the same time, it's not so clunky. It's not like some, straight back or something like that. It's not like it's got some huge swooping belly or a super high tip or anything like that. You can still use this for smaller tasks if you need to. If you need to, pick this up and open up a box, you can get this tip down, you can drag it through. If you need to, cut through some twine, this tip gets skinny and it gets fine enough that you can use this for more delicate work. There's a lot of blade between your hand and that tip there, but we'll get into the ergos. You feel like you have enough control. You can do those more delicate tasks. It's just, there's nothing mind-blowing about the blade shape. There's nothing innovative about the blade shape here. The blade design, on the other hand, is quite pretty. Hinderer, as always, has an excellent stone wash. The way they do their stone washes, you see those stones a little bit more than you see on a lot of other knives. And it's more of, a hazy wash, but it's very attractive. Their laser etching is always very nice. Again, this swedge detail here and the way they put this little curve gives you sort of a place to post up your thumb. It's a bit of a stretch, but you can get there. It's the little design details they've done throughout are all very nice. Nice plunge, nice sharpening choil. Very cool looking jimping. I really like the way the Hinderer does their jimping. These big, thick jimps. They're sort of like just tanky. They, put some chamfers onto the edges of the jimping here and then round them off with the stone wash. It looks really nice. It makes it look a little less aggressive, a little more sort of artistic. Everything is very nicely knocked down throughout. The edges of the swedge, the edges of these transitions. Nice and just clean. It looks and feels very premium. It looks and feels just extremely well finished. On the other side, you've got USA S45VN. The rest of it's sterile, except for your tri-way mark here, which, by the way, is set up so that sometimes, the tri-way can sometimes look a little bit funny when it's like closed. The tri-way mark seems to be set up so that when the knife is basically held like this, it's pointing straight down. That seems to be how they chose to orient it. This is a flipper-only Hinderer. There is no thumb stud on it, and there is no front finger choil. That is purely a sharpening choil there. But the flipper tab is sort of what people have wanted for a long time from your XM18 flipper tab. I love the XM18 flipper tab. I think it's really easy to get purchased on. Catch your finger, snaps open, and works nicely as a finger guard. I love it. But a lot of people complain it's too jimpy, it's too pokey, it hurts your finger, and that bothers them. This flipper tab still keeps that hook design and still keeps it so it functions as a finger guard when it's open. But it's just a little more rounded. It's a little nicer on the finger while still having that curve that catches your finger, and it's still very functional, very easy to flip. Which brings us to your action. And like most Hinderers, this is an excellent, excellent action. Like most Hinderers in 2024, I should say. Detent on this is a big flipper tab. Lots of purchase. It's a decently stiff detent. It just doesn't feel that way because this flipper tab is so good. You pull back, very nice detent break, very crisp. And then it is a nice, smooth shake shut on the close here on bearings. Kind of feels a little chunkier than something like a Shirogoro because the blade is so heavy, and it's not at that level. But it is as good as a bearing action needs to be. The detent break is crisp. The detent on the close is a little later than I'd like, but not too late. Nice and smooth, nice and even. Centers very consistently and evenly. I've never had even a hint of play. It's typical Hinderer action 2024, and then you've got the benefit of the tri-way on top of that, which is if you want that sort of slower, more controlled action, you can throw phosphor bronze washers on here, and I'm sure it will run fine. If you like that kind of rubbery, sort of smoother, again, rubbery is the term that comes to mind, but you like that Teflon washer action, you can throw Teflon washers in here. I'm sure it'll run great. This, I have never felt the need to swap it out from bearings, and the action has been solid since I've gotten it. Now let's go into this handle design. So this is a big, chunky, thick handle. The biggest difference when you compare it to something like the XM18, now I'll have a whole video comparing these two as well. The XM18 starts kind of thick, but then even though it curves, it's not a thick handle. It's kind of narrow. It just has a lot of curve and a lot of jimping that does the work for it. This thing is really a big rectangle. It's a big brick. It still has a bit of that curve down toward the bottom and the overall lines, but it's more straight across the top. It's more straight across the bottom. Ergonomically, because you don't have that front finger choil, you're going to post up in this front finger index, thumb on the jimping, very nice jimping, doesn't grab your thumb or anything like that. Like, it's not too grabby, but you feel it. It's more for indexing than purchase, but it does give you some resistance, and probably if you had gloves on, it would grab a little bit more. This is 1 to 2, I mean, it's really one finger here, but it's one comfortable finger, even if you got larger or gloved hands, will fit right in there. Rest of your fingers go nicely here. This big flat here, and this chamfer roll nicely into your palm. I mean, it is just sort of a big slab, but it's a comfortable slab. You know, I kind of would like this to curve down a little bit more, but the fact is, when you then get to using this knife, this is the only grip that you've got for it, but it is a very secure grip. This knife does not want to wiggle. It does not want to rock. This blade edge extends very naturally from the handle, whether you're sort of grabbing it like this to drag it and pull it through things, or you're grabbing it like this to push. It is in that echelon of knives that the blade is just sort of naturally where you want it to be. At the same time, it's got the same sort of handle feel as something like an AD20, where you got these sort of two ends here that are keeping your hand very securely captive on that handle and making sure that you don't run up onto the blade, it doesn't slip out. It is what you would expect from a handle of this size and this overall stature. The size makes it really secure. You combine that with the fact that it is a heavy knife. It is quite handle heavy in the hand. You know, you absolutely feel it. This is a big hard use knife, and this feels like a knife that you can push through pretty much everything. This really feels like it does meet that top end of hard use knives. This is about as heavy duty as you would need a folding knife to be. The only ones that I can think of that are really more robust in how they feel are, you know, you could give a slight edge to some of the Demcos. You could give a slight edge to an SMF, something like that. But this is absolutely up there it's as secure in the hand, feels as heavy duty as anything that you would need to carry. Otherwise, just get a fixed blade. Scale design here, typical Hinderer G10 scales. You've got your small chamfer all the way around with their really nicely done, this sort of wavy texture they use to put a texture on the G10. Again, if you want grip, it will give you grip. If you're not gripping hard, your fingers just sort of skate right over it. It's a really nice alternative to a peel ply. It also looks nice. You've got all your only 3 screws here, all custom screws. And by the way, one thing that they took from the full track, let me see if I can get it out here, is your back spacer. Pulls right out. It's got a little spring nest right there. This is your pivot tool. This fits that and that and that. You can disassemble the whole knife with a tool that is built into the back spacer. And by the way, that is never coming out the way that is set in there. Really cool. Totally optional in the sense that, like most people looking at this, if you're looking at a $500 knife, you probably got a few tool sets. But if for some reason you need to, you know, play around with or clean out your XM18 out in the field and you don't have your tools, you've got the tool to do it right there. That's cool. And then on the back side, the XM18 comes with a textured titanium side. There are very few Hinderers, at least in the XM18 and the Eclipse and the Jurassic lineup. The traditional Hinderers, most of them have a flat lock side. The lock side on the Project X is textured on, I believe, every single one of them. That is very cool. The texturing on the titanium looks absolutely gorgeous. The way it catches the light. The chamfers are a little bit larger on this side. All the hardware fits perfectly. You've got your Hinderer lock bar stabilizer there. You've got your logo. It's a pretty, very, very nicely done knife. There's nothing that I can criticize with the fit and finish, the way that they have cut these scales, the way they've done all of this. It's just, honestly, it's a beautiful knife. And I've had multiple people, as I've been carrying this one, especially when they see that show side, they're just like, wow, that is a really pretty looking knife. And it is. It's just fantastically well done, very well executed. And it is aiming for a relatively high level of execution here. How tight everything fits together. Your lockup here, if you look at how closely this blade fits into the scales, you look at how nicely centered this is, you look at, this is not a trivial milling pattern right here. Even things like the extra, milling in your lock bar relief there. The fact that the tri-way system even works, that is a significant level of fit and finish to get that there. This is a really good example of the level that Hinderer is operating at in 2024. And I do put them, in terms of fit and finish, at the same level these days, maybe very slightly below. But for all anybody cares about, they are functionally at the same level as Chris Reeve knives. They're not quite as tight. What Hinderer does, their designs tend to be a little bit more complex. There's a little bit more going on. Chris Reeves are a little simpler and a little tighter. Chris Reeves are tighter than Hinderers. The tolerances are a little bit snugger. But frankly, Hinderers, considering the hundreds of knives that they put out every single year, might be thousands of knives by this point, they're doing really, really good work at the ranch. So all of that said, this is a big knife that cuts better than most Hinderers, that is just as secure in the hand as most Hinderers. It's big, it's heavy, it's not something you're going to use as your little 3-inch EDC. That nobody's going to ask like, oh, should I buy a Spyderco Native or should I buy a Project X? Like, that's a dumb question. But everything that you would expect from a knife of this size, it does really, really well. Which brings us to the scores, which are really, really good. This is again, I believe that this is the single highest scoring knife that I've had on my table so far. Again, I score across 10 sections here. Sorry, that one got kind of smudged out. I score across 10 scores. 5 are related to the fun factor, sort of the knife guy, fidget factor and look and feel and all that sort of stuff. And then 5 are based on the functionality. And so let's get to it. First, blade design. Blade design is a solid A. And there's nothing unusual about doing a big clip point with a belly out the front and a big flat across the bottom. But Hinderer has executed this really, really well. The amount that they chose to drop this takes away the biggest downside of this thick stock and makes it so it legitimately slices. The balance they have between the belly and the flat is really useful for the sort of task you would use this for. And then every bit of the details of the execution is done at as high a level as you're going to get in production. The way that they've chosen to do the transitions, the way the stonewash washes it out, the way they've knocked down the edges, the jimping, this little swedge up here, the little swoop that you get a little bit of sort of harpoon action there. It's just a really, really pretty aesthetic and functional rendition of a clip point blade. This is as good as clip points get in the production sphere. That is a solid A. Handle design, I'm going to call an A-. It looks cool. This is a big, tough looking handle. It sort of screams like, I want you to grab me and use me hard. It's got simple, straight lines. Again, it's sort of that full track heritage. Hinderer is trying to make, just a bigger, sort of more straight knife here than the more curvy designs of the XM and Eclipse and Jurassic series. But the way that they do all of these little indexes, the way that there's all these more complex shapes out of the front, it's not that complicated when you really break it down, but it's executed very well. It looks very nice, both folded up and open, and it fits in the hand very nicely. There's nothing exceptional about it. There's nothing about this handle that is anything to write home about, though I do give it at least an extra sort of letter, meaning this might be the thing that takes it from a B minus or B plus to an A minus. The fully milled show side is ridiculously pretty. Like the way that this catches light, and honestly the way that it feels with the stone washing on it, it feels great in the hand. It looks cool. It makes this thing look and feel super duper premium. You add that to the fact that, I guess it's technically part of the handle. You get this built-in pivot tool right here that does all of your hardware. It's just cool. It's not necessarily my favorite Hinderer handle design by itself. I think I do still like the handle of the XM18 a little bit more than the handle of the Project X. But the handle of the XM18 is one of the best handle designs in the industry. So, solid A minus there. Action on pretty much every modern Hinderer is going to be a solid A. This is kind of like the definition of a solid A for me. It is on bearings, where it comes from the factory. It's a fantastic bearing action, crisp detent brake, easily shakes shut. When you lube it up and you break it in, it will eventually drop shut. Most Hinderers do. And the fact that you get the versatility of the tri-way on top of that, and you can make it into whatever sort of action you want. It's really, really well executed production action. It's not as sublime as anything like a Shirogorov. It's not as, each of the individual actions isn't as great as the best of the best that you get in that very high production or that custom market. But at $400 or $500, the price ranges that Hinderer plays in, this is as good an action as you're going to find. And to put it the other way, I can't find any actions, certainly bearing actions, and I think most people are going to keep this on bearings. There aren't any bearing actions that I can think of at this price point that are significantly better than what Hinderer is doing in 2024, especially with the really, really good flipper tab that they put on the Project X. Solid A. Fit and finish, same thing. I've talked about the fit and finish plenty already in this review. Even little things like, there isn't internal, actually no, there is internal. No, there's not internal milling on this side. Actually, there isn't any internal milling at all on either side. But the fact is, even little things like this, the relief here, all the little details throughout, the way they do their chamfer, super, super clean, the way everything fits together. Again, this is not a trivial handle texture. The finishing on the blade is fantastic. Everything is just super tight. You never have to worry about centering. And again, the fact that the tri-way system works is a testament to the level of fit and finish. Hinderer, they're not as sublime as you will get if you go to higher price points. They're not as immaculate as a Chris Reeve. But Hinderers in 2024 are a solid A in fit and finish. They are, you even paying $500, you will not be disappointed about the way all of this fits together. And I've had no issues and have seen no issues whatsoever with the fit and finish on my Project X. And the cool factor, I'm going to call it A minus. And that's only because, especially when you get used to looking at this knife, there's an immediate cool factor, honestly, from getting a Hinderer that cuts. Like, that was the thing that blew me away the most when I got the Project X. The design, honestly, it looks kind of like bucktooth chunky. Like, it's not a pretty knife. It's big, it's chunky, it's this big rectangle handle. There's nothing elegant, there's nothing sleek, and there's also nothing that feels even really tactical about it. It looks and feels kind of like a big old tool, and it's just a bit like in some ways when you really look closely at it, and especially once you use it a bunch and the novelty wears away. It's not a pretty knife. But there is a significant cool factor. There's a significant cool factor to every Hinderer because they're just so tough. The way they do their jimping, the way they do these textures, just that, you combine the handle design, you combine the heritage of Hinderer, all of that together. They've got an oomph about them. They've got a feel about them. And that's totally present here. But really, a lot of that cool factor comes from the fact that this is a Hinderer that cuts. And that's just cool in and of itself. A- because there's nothing super distinctive about this. And it is a little just... It's not a pretty knife. But there's also nothing uninteresting about it. But the fact is, fun factor, solid A. Solid A. Knife enthusiasts will find nothing to criticize about the way that this knife is designed or the way that it is put together. I think that you will feel from that sense that you're getting every bit of your $500 for it. Again, if you're the sort of person that plays in this price range, I assume by the fact that you're looking at this review that you are, or at least that you're interested in knowing about it. Cutting performance. This is a Hinderer that is getting an A in cutting performance, and I am as surprised as you are to say that. I literally, the first time that I used this Project X to cut stuff, I literally had I stopped cutting and I was like, holy cow, because I was shocked at how well this blade cut. Whatever combination it is of the factory edge that they put on it and just the fact that this thing has more space to drop, this cuts like I want Hinderers to cut. This slices through cardboard like a dream, paper like a dream, packages, and then you put it into the harder use stuff, your branches, your twigs, your plant material, drag it through dirt, drag it through drywall, all that sort of stuff. It just cuts really, really well. And honestly, it makes the cutting performance of like this skinny XM18, I have managed by laying the edge back to get it so that the cutting performance is not bad. And so that makes it so that I can tolerate this knife and actually enjoy this knife because there's a lot I like about this knife, but it just didn't cut that well from the factory, and now it cuts okay. It cuts about as well as a PM2 or something like that, maybe a little better. Same thing like this Eclipse here. This is one of the hollow ground Eclipses, review coming up on this one, but it cuts okay. It cuts well enough that it's not an issue. This legitimately cuts great. I don't quite know exactly what combination of things make it cut so much better than my other Hinderers, but boy oh boy does it cut so much better than all my other Hinderers. It's a legitimate A in cutting performance, and if you, like me, are somebody that has been historically frustrated by the cutting performance of Hinderers, I highly suggest you give the Project X a try, and I hope that you have the same experience that I have, which is that it is really in a different league from everything else that Hinderer has put out in terms of cutting performance. The only one that I can't say authoritatively, I haven't tried recent Jurassics, which do have similar space for the blade to drop. So those might be similar, but it's certainly substantially better than any of the XM18s, Eclipses, or even the FireTac that I've tried from the factory. Utility, A. Keeping in mind that this is a big knife that you're going to use for big knife tasks. This is not going to be your light everyday carry. This is not a replacement for your bug out. Simple, versatile clip point, simple big handle that rolls into the hand nicely, no hot spots, no ergonomic issues. Is it heavy? Yeah, but you knew it's going to be heavy. It's a Hinderer. It's meant to be big and tough. I'll sort of talk about utility and feel a little bit together. Because this blade cuts so well, because this is such a versatile blade shape, and because, you've got this relatively neutral handle, honestly, that just has a couple big curves here and does most of the work just by being big. For the stuff you would use a big knife for, this does it all well. This has always felt secure in the hand. It's always felt like I can push it hard, drive it hard, things like that. It is very satisfying in that way. It is limited in the sense that it does feel like a lot of knife for, cutting open an Amazon package, but also because this is a neutral handle, doesn't have any big curves and stuff like that, it doesn't have the issue I had with something like the Emerson CQC15. If I do need to, choke up on this knife and use it to, cut into a package, I can do that. I can put my middle finger here, grip up on the blade. These fingers are plain secure, and I can use it for smaller and more delicate tasks. It's not so heavy in the handle that it feels like I've got too much sticking out. It feels like I've got lots of control over this blade. So this is about as versatile as a knife that this size is going to get while still excelling at those big heavy-duty tasks. So solid A there, about as utilitarian, about as versatile as a 3.6-inch, 6-ounce knife is going to be. Not exceptional, but certainly better than, say, something like an XM24, which can feel like an extremely large knife when you try to do it with anything other than large knife tasks. Not as versatile as your XM18, but the blade being so much better makes it more of a pleasure to use in practice. Feel, A-. Again, I've talked a lot about that in the last section. The main reason that this is A- is I do kind of bemoan the loss of a finger choil here. If I did have a finger choil, this grip would be potentially really, really nice for choking up and for more delicate stuff. And then the fact that you've only got that flipper tab option, you can, when you're doing smaller tasks here, this grip here, which is your only grip with this big finger guard here, you can feel kind of far from what you're cutting when you're trying to do more precise stuff. That's just a function of the design of the knife. They obviously wanted to prioritize security in those hard use tasks over a little more versatility for those smaller tasks. They wanted to get you more cutting edge, and I do appreciate that. Not having that finger choil does mean that you've got more edge to pass through stuff. So I'm only going to dock it a little bit, but when I'm coming from stuff like your XM18 that ends up being, so good in so many different grips and positions, it does feel a little more limited than some of Hinderer's other work. So A-, very good at what it's good at, just not quite as versatile as some other Hinderers. Carry. So I'm giving this a B. It's a big, thick, heavy knife. It is as thick. Actually, it's probably thicker. Let's compare it to your AD20. No, it's the same thickness as your AD20S. It's thinner than your AD20, but the only downside of the Demcos is they do kind of suck to carry. Same thickness as your full thickness Eclipse. Thicker, obviously, than your skinny XM18s. A lot thicker than, say, your Sebenza here. Heavier than your Sebenza, but a lot bigger and a lot tougher. Well, not necessarily tougher, but bigger with more aggressive ergonomics than your Sebenza. The fact is, nobody's expecting this knife to be light and easy to carry, but part of the benefit of this big chunky handle design is that blade does fold pretty significantly into the handle here. This is such a big knife that you will always feel it in your pocket. It takes up a bunch of space. And you know what, honestly, as I talk a little bit more, this really should be a B- for carry, just because it is, it's big. It's big. I don't know where my pen went, but this will be, I'll edit it in, when I put this in the database, it'll be a B- in carry, won't affect the other scores. But for a big knife, it carries well. This sort of rectangle fits nice and neatly into your pocket. Because you've got stone-washed, titanium and G10 here, you don't have to worry about accumulating too many snails. Nothing is grabby, nothing is pokey, anything like that. It does carry about as nicely as a knife of this size could. So I want to give it credit for that, and rather than criticizing it for not being something it's not trying to be. You're not trying to get a light, easy carry for this, and honestly, given the amount of utility and the amount of sort of blade performance for those harder use tasks that you get from the Project X, it feels like the carry burden is proportionate to the performance you get. And then value is a B. I've already talked plenty about how I believe the level of performance the Hinderer is delivering in terms of fit and finish, in terms of design complexity, and in terms of the little features you get, like the built-in tool, like the tri-way pivot, all that sort of stuff, completely justifies the $500 price. Again, if you're the sort of person that has any business paying $500, and I will say a huge part of that has to be, you do have to find some value in having a knife made in the USA. If you don't care whether your knife is made in the USA, then the part of the value proposition for this is lost. But if you care about those things, and if you're looking at Hinderer, you are. I'm pretty sure just about everybody that buys Hinderers at least partially buys them because they're made in the USA, or at least made in a Western nation. The level of fit and finish they're delivering, the level of materials they're delivering, the level of design complexity and thought, and then those additional little features totally justify the price without it feeling like a particularly good value or bad value. So all that rolls up to an A-, a very smudged out A- in function, and an A grade overall. And I think this is the first A that I have given, and it feels that way. This really is peak Hinderer, at least in 2024. This takes most of what makes designs like the XM18 and designs like the Eclipse so good. The way that Rick Hinderer thinks about ergonomics, the way that he thinks about blade designs, the way that he makes his knives built for hard use, the level of fit and finish he brings, the level of polish he brings, the design touches he brings to his blade designs and his handle design, stuff like that. All the stuff that lots of people have loved about Hinderers for many years. It keeps all of those things. And then it completely eliminates, to an extent that still kind of shocks me, it completely eliminates the one big issue that almost all of those knives have had, which is that the things can't cut that well, and if they do cut, it's only when you do a lot of stuff to either regrind them or at least lay the edge back. And Hinderer with the Project X has come out with a knife that has everything that is good about Hinderer, and then can also cut really, really well on top of that. And so I have nothing bad to say about this knife. I have no caveats for this knife. You have to know what you're buying. This is a big, chunky, heavy, expensive knife. This is a unnecessarily well-made tool. But boy, oh boy, I mean, for years I have been going back and forth about Hinderer as a brand. I have hemmed and hawed about whether I like Hinderers or not, because there's so many things that I like about Hinderers. And honestly, until I learned to sharpen, they were of no interest to me practically, because the factory edges on them were so bad, they just weren't useful as knives to me. And then even once I learned to sharpen, they were great, with the big caveat that every time I got a Hinderer, I was going to have to spend 30 minutes on my sharpening system, taking that edge way back just to get something that cut decently, still not even well. And the Project X has completely fixed that. This is still, honestly, it's not a knife that I'm going to carry all that often. It's not a knife, because I just don't have a use for a knife this big and this heavy duty all that often. But it is, during the times that I do need a big heavy knife, I can't think of many, put it this way, there are no options I can think of that are markedly better for a big heavy knife. Maybe a Strider SMF can go a little harder than this one. But like, the fact is, and that's why I'm making a video about this, if you want a big heavy duty that is but still pocketable knife, folding knife in 2024, it is a 2-horse race for something that is legitimately built for hard use. And now both of these options are exceptional. This is, I think, for most people, it's a lot bigger of a design, so, you know, it's not nearly as versatile as your XM18, especially when you fold it up. I mean, the XM18 is a lot smaller in the pocket. I like the ergonomics on the XM18 better. I won't go into a whole comparative review, because I will have a video just comparing these two for people that are familiar with the XM18. But I think everybody who has liked Hinderer signature models will find a lot to like about the Project X. And I also think a lot of people, a group that includes myself, that have historically either been frustrated with Hinderer or have outright disliked Hinderer knives, largely because of those deficiencies in cutting performance, will find that the Project X has finally solved that issue in a meaningful way and has created a much better and more useful knife because of it. If you are the sort of person that is willing to drop $500 on a knife, and you are the sort of person that has a use case for a 3.6-inch, 6-ounce knife, you know, you are the sort of person that does tasks that are heavy duty enough to justify that profile, or you just like carrying knives this big and heavy, this is absolutely one of the best knives on the market in this size range, in this weight range, in this price range, in this performance profile. Easily recommendable to anybody who is in the target audience for this, and really one to check out even if Hinderers have frustrated you in the past. Just really, really good work. I kind of tried the Project X on a flyer. I thought I was going to, you know, get it and pass it on pretty quickly, because honestly, I don't like the design profile by itself quite as much as the XM18, but the blade performance here just does put it at a different level. So, hope you found that helpful. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, your experience with the Project X. I hope that some of you have had the same sort of experiences that I have, because I found this a really surprisingly impressive knife and I've really enjoyed using it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. This has been Clark the Knife. Again, hope you found this useful. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.